Introduction. It was the summer before my final year in high school when my family decided to take a road trip down to Mexico to visit some distant relatives. My parents thought it would be a good way for us to connect with our roots, spend some time together, and take a break from the hustle of life back home. I wasn't exactly thrilled at first, but the idea of escaping the city for a while didn't sound so bad. We ended up staying in a small town nestled along a wide river, far from the usual tourist spots. The town was quiet and peaceful, with cobblestone streets, old adobe houses, and a charm that felt almost frozen in time. We stayed at my great-aunt's place, a large, creaky old house that had seen better days. My cousin Alejandro, who was about my age, lived there too. We hadn't seen each other in years, but we hit it off pretty quickly, bonding over stories and wandering around the small town. One night, after dinner, my aunt warned us not to go near the river after dark. "Stay away," she said in a low, serious voice. "La Llorona walks there." Alejandro smirked, rolling his eyes. "It's just an old story," he whispered to me after. "People around here love to scare tourists." But the way my aunt's eyes had darkened when she spoke of La Llorona made me uneasy. I'd heard the legend before, how she was a weeping woman who wandered near rivers, searching for her drowned children, cursing anyone who crossed her path. It was just a story. Right? Or at least, I thought so. Rising tension, the next evening, after the sun had set, Alejandro convinced me to sneak out with him and some of his friends. "Come on," he said, grinning. "Let's check out the river. It's not far. Besides, La Llorona isn't real." I hesitated, remembering my aunt's warning, but Alejandro's confidence was infectious. It was just a river, and I didn't want to seem like a coward. So, against my better judgment, I agreed to go. We slipped out of the house quietly and met up with two of Alejandro's friends. The night was warm, the air thick with the scent of the nearby trees and the distant sound of crickets. As we walked through the narrow streets toward the river, the quiet felt heavier than usual, as if the town was holding its breath. When we reached the riverbank, it was almost completely dark. The water shimmered in the moonlight, a silvery ribbon that snaked through the town. We sat down near the edge, laughing and sharing stories, but my attention kept drifting to the water. I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that something was off. That's when I heard it. A faint sound, so quiet at first I thought I was imagining it. It was like the soft wail of someone crying, carried on the breeze. I froze, straining to hear. "Alejandro," I whispered, nudging him. "Do you hear that?" He frowned, but before he could answer, the crying grew louder. The others stopped talking, their eyes widening as the sound filled the air, an eerie, mournful wail that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Then, from across the river, I saw her. A figure, dressed in a tattered white dress, her long dark hair hanging over her face, was standing by the water's edge. She was weeping softly, her shoulders shaking as she moved closer to the water. The sound of her crying sent chills down my spine. "Climax," one of Alejandro's friends whispered, "is that her?" I couldn't speak, couldn't take my eyes off her. The crying grew louder, more desperate, as she bent down toward the water. For a moment, I thought she was about to step in, but then she stopped and slowly turned her head toward us. Her face. It was pale, almost ghostly, and her eyes were dark, hollow pits of sorrow and rage. Her lips parted, and the wailing intensified, a heart-wrenching, soul-piercing cry that made my blood run cold. "La Llorona," Alejandro whispered, his voice shaking. We stood there, frozen, as she began to move toward us. Her feet glided over the ground, her sobbing echoing in the night. I wanted to run, but my legs wouldn't move. Her eyes locked onto mine, and in that moment, I felt her grief wash over me, crushing, suffocating. It was like her pain had seeped into my bones, paralyzing me with fear. Then she spoke, her voice a haunting whisper carried by the wind. "Where are my children? Have you seen them?" Her words sent a wave of terror through me, and finally, I snapped out of my daze. "Run!" I shouted, grabbing Alejandro's arm. We bolted, tearing through the trees and back toward the town. Behind us, I could still hear her cries, growing fainter but no less chilling. The wind picked up, howling through the trees, and I could swear I heard her voice in the wind, calling out again, "Mis hijos, ¿dónde están mis hijos?" We didn't stop running until we reached the safety of my aunt's house, slamming the door behind us, our hearts pounding in our chests. Back in the house, we tried to catch our breath, our hands shaking. My aunt was waiting for us in the kitchen, her face pale and serious. She didn't ask where we had been. She didn't need to. "You saw her, didn't you?" she said quietly. I nodded, still trying to make sense of what had happened. "You're lucky you came back," she said. "Many who hear her cry are never seen again. She's always searching for her children, and sometimes she takes others to replace them." Alejandro and I didn't sleep that night. We stayed up, listening to the wind, half expecting to hear her weeping again. And even now, months later, I still hear that sound in my dreams, the soft, mournful cry of La Llorona, searching for her lost children. And I wonder, what would have happened if we hadn't run?